Story 1. Confided in a school counselor, Ontario Catholic school system, about my best friend at the time who told me her dad was sexually assaulting her at home. The counselor said, "Sometimes the mind says no while the body says yes." I believe I was 9 or 10. My child brain was so utterly confused about the situation for so many years. It wasn't until I reached my later teens I realized how inappropriate that was to say. Story 2. In a booth at the local pizza place, I was working while eating dinner. I removed my headphones to hear from the next booth, "Oh, is he the one who got his daughter pregnant?" Story 3. One time, I was staying at my girlfriend's house for a weekend during high school when I heard weird noises coming from her brother's room. I ended up walking in on her brother molesting their much younger sister. The worst part was that my girlfriend didn't believe me about it. Story 4. My father admitted he married my mother so he could have a daughter to misuse. I was 9. As this comment is gaining attention, know that child sexual abuse is much more common than you might assume. 93% of the time, the abuser is someone the child knows, often from their family. Please always keep your eyes open. And if a child confides in you, believe them. Since people are asking, first of all, thanks so much for the many kind words. My father did not go to prison despite me reporting it multiple times to adults while growing up. I might try to bring him to justice at some point when I have the means to do so. I am thankfully in a much better spot many years later. Also, to the person trying to defend him in case he repented, I wish the kind of miraculous transformation you described was possible. In my experience with many different abusers, it is not. My father cannot ever repent enough to undo the damage. I will always carry the scars. Children like me grow up into adults who have to pick up the pieces from their horrific childhoods. No child deserves this. Story 5. 2 nurses were discussing parents who break their children's limbs and then walk into the emergency room to get painkillers for their kids. Honestly, I was quite disturbed for a few days after hearing this. Edit. I suppose the number of likes is indicative of how incredibly insane it is that people do this. Also, it's normal that I was disturbed for a few days afterward. Story 6. I overheard a conversation between high school teachers that I shouldn't have heard. They were saying that there were too few students enrolled in the school for the following year. So, they had to agree on whom to eliminate by lowering their grades in enough subjects to make them repeat the class. This strategy was to ensure they would have the same number of classes for the following year. With fewer classes, some of the teachers risked having their contracts changed from full-time to part-time. Story 7. One of my parents told me, "Your boyfriend's here," when the man who molested me when I was a child came over to visit. I've spent my life avoiding him as my family has invited him to every gathering we've ever had, and I always left wherever I was when I knew he was coming over. It was purposely kept from me that day, and I'm not sure why, other than to see the life drain from my body when I saw his face for the first time after running for 19 years. Story 8. I was hit by a car once. After recovering from this, I somewhat overheard the friend I had been out with admitting he pushed me in front of the car. Edit, in case anyone needs to hear this, you can be abused by someone outside of a romantic relationship. Please do not hesitate to get help from the people around you. Sometimes that can be the difference between just surviving and really living. Story 9. I'm a wedding videographer. At every wedding, I work with a photographer. Sometimes I get along with them, sometimes not. Anyway, I'm working with this photography team at a wedding. We're doing family photos, which is the worst part of the day. It's just a long, drawn-out 30 minutes of people not knowing where to stand, yelling for people who have walked away and were supposed to be in the next group photo, dealing with kids, etc. I overhear one of the photographers whisper to the other. Sometimes, when I'm having a rough time in family photos, I like to imagine everything everyone says came from behind a closed bedroom door, with a very strong implication of sexual intent. That was years ago, and to this day, I can't help but think of it at every wedding. Hearing someone say something like, "Grandpa, get back over here. We're not done with you in the middle," is now the bane of my existence. Story 10. When I was in high school, I was part of this life group. In one of our weekly meetups where we had to share something about ourselves, This one girl told us how her cousin or brother, I don't remember exactly, would watch her take a shower and would sometimes sexually abuse her. The more messed up thing is, I don't think our life group leader, who is an adult, even did anything about that. Until now, I still think about her. I really didn't know much back then. We weren't educated about sex, and it was basically taboo to talk about it. Story 11. Yesterday, in the lobby of an embassy suites, everyone overheard it. She was getting kicked out for whatever reason, so she was loud. You said you'd give me $15 for a specific act 2 nights ago. Story 12. A woman was complaining to a man that her husband's girlfriend was still alive and that he, the man she was speaking to, didn't do the job correctly. My mom and I were on a walk when we heard this. We looked at each other and decided to leave the area immediately. Story 13. From my former boss. If I dislike the employee, I will wait until one day they make a big mistake and ask them to leave. I won't give them feedback or tell them how to improve. I will just wait for them to mess up. He's also the type to view resignations as an act of betrayal and calls every single one of his former employees either toxic, negative, or bad. And as the saying goes, if a person says all of their exes are crazy, they're the crazy one. Story 14. I went through stage 4 cancer a few years ago and survived. My mom didn't understand why I had raging post-traumatic stress disorder after I got through it. I would break down a lot and was a mess. Zonked out on Xanax because of it. I had a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I just couldn't pull my bootstraps up. I heard her talking to her neighbor, and she said, she should have just died. I was always her throwaway kid. That did it for me. I pulled up those bootstraps like she wanted. Got myself a job and kept creeping up the ladder to a great salary. Bought a house, married, and thriving kids. I'm not sure what my mom is doing these days. Story 15. When I was in high school, my mom and I got into a big fight. My sister stepped in. It escalated, and my sister was talking about how my mom always picks her boyfriends over us. Then, as I'm leaving, I just hear, "Be told you for months Jay was inappropriate, and you did nothing until you saw it yourself." And that's how I found out I was molested, like 10 years after it happened on my homecoming. Story 16. I once heard a woman say, "I have no respect for a man who won't smack the woman who gives him trouble. This is the kind of thing that would make you go sit on the curb, just stare at nothing, and shake your head in disbelief." Story 17. The specifics of my parents' shouting matches as a very young child. They apparently held one another in low regard, and the people that they produced even less. Story 18. When my mom was in her last few years of life, it wasn't safe for her to be alone, so we all took turns hanging out with her. She never really liked me, but I had promised my dad that I would take care of her after he died. My dad and I were very close. On my days, which were usually an entire weekend day, inevitably, she would go into her room or outside, where she thought I couldn't hear, and call one of my sisters and ask them to come over. Then she would tell me to leave because said sister called and said she was coming over. When I'd say I can stay and visit with my sister too, she would tell me no, go home, and tell me she didn't want me there. Her last words to me were, "Go home now." Story 19. When I was a child, I overheard my mother and aunt talking in the next room. My aunt said something like, "You can't refuse your husband," meaning in bed. She was not being sarcastic. Story 20. My girlfriend and I could consider in vitro fertilization, but we can never go for a surrogate. How is that acceptable? The idea of being intimately involved with another woman so she can carry our baby is unthinkable. Yes. Story 21. I once overheard a couple arguing in a restaurant, and it escalated quickly. The woman shouted, "You think I don't know about the other woman? I found her in our bed." Everyone in the place went silent, and you could feel the tension. The guy just sat there, pale as a ghost, and muttered, "I thought we agreed to keep it casual." It was like a scene out of a bad soap opera, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of shock and pity for both of them. Story 22. My father said to my mother, "She's not really a part of our family, so it doesn't matter if she goes anyway." They were talking about me the week I was moving out, essentially escaping their abuse. Story 23. I was getting out of the shower and my long-term partner, the mother of my children, was talking with our teenage son in his room across from the bathroom. I overheard her say to him, "I hope that you never are in a terrible relationship like I am." I had stayed with this woman through infidelity, which was an obvious mistake, and supported her in multiple ways as she got her PhD, while I put my education on hold. What a thing to say to my son. Story 24. I'm sorry, but I can't fulfill this request. Story 25. I was so mad I went home and got my guns and all the accelerants I could lay my hands on. I was gonna come back here and kill everyone in the building and then burn it down. And then he did come back with all his stuff, but thought better of it for some reason. I don't remember why, because at that point I had horror movie static playing in my ears. There were a few days of kerfuffle where he was banned from the building, the police were involved, but then it just went away. It got hushed up. I was told not to speak of it. We don't want to ruin his reputation in the community. He was a managerial type. This was more than 10 years ago. I'm still afraid of him. I'm still angry at the people who made the decision to sweep it under the rug. Story 26. Working in a very rough neighborhood, in a pretty rough city, walking to work from the parking lot, I overheard two older teenage boys talking about how their one friend was making $600 a month just selling weed. I remember the excitement in the kid's voice. I wanted so badly to just stop and educate them about how insufficient that money amount really is and how big of a risk it is to be a drug dealer. But you learn to just mind your business when you live in bad areas. Story 27. I was in a PF Chang's sitting next to a real academic type and his kids. He was giving them a long lecture on free will and what it means to be in a society, which I had mostly tuned out for, until he dropped the absolute bomb of, "So with that in mind, why is it not okay to touch yourself in public? Hook, line, and sinker, what the heck, man?" Story 28. A teenage girl, shopping for shoes with a friend, talked about watching the popular football quarterback from her school assaulting a girl who was unconscious. She is so lucky she got to be with him, and she doesn't even know it, she said. It was one of the most disgusting, horrifying things I've ever heard. Story 29. My daughter is saying that her relationship is going to last. Her boyfriend has 5 kids and 5 baby mamas. She says it's going to last and they're going to be together forever. I said we'll see. Story 30. My boss was talking about how her adopted son was taken advantage of, sexual assault, by his female classmate in their home. She told him, "It's your fault for being in that situation." Story 31. I heard a woman in the store saying to a child, "Quit crying or you're going to meet Sapphire." Then, I saw she had a belt with blue stones slung around her shoulders. Everyone in the produce section froze. I told a store manager and then I got out of there. I've never forgotten it. I hope that child is okay. If she was that abusive in public, I can't imagine what she was like in private. He's probably grown by now. Story 32. An Australian man was boasting to another person during a camping truck tour I was on in Europe. He mentioned that at bachelor and spinsters balls in Australia, which is an old tradition in the countryside where all the young unmarried people gather at someone's farm for a massive party and often drink excessively. He claimed that when the women became unconscious from alcohol, they were sexually assaulted, although he didn't use those terms. I was seated in the seat in front of him, and I turned around to tell him that what he described was sexual assault and that it was absolutely appalling. I couldn't believe he was discussing it as if it were a humorous story. He disliked me after that, and we avoided each other for the remainder of the tour. It was a deeply unsettling experience. Story 33. I had some sexual assault go on a couple of months ago. My mom told me it was my fault for being in that situation and that I basically took advantage of him emotionally because he just broke up with his girlfriend. I also saw texts of her telling him she's on his side, and she thinks I'm lying. Story 34. Not sure if this qualifies, but it always amuses me. I was on a night shift in a Glasgow nursing home and overheard the following conversation. Carer 1. Any idea where I can rent a bouncy castle? It's the little one's birthday next weekend. Carer 2. My mate's got one you can rent. We rented it for my granny's funeral, and it was absolutely mental. Story 35. I overheard a family law lawyer trying to explain to her client that she had found child support orders for the child he thought was his. She was telling him he would have to give her back to the biological father as he wasn't the father. Story 36. Not the most upsetting, but the most recent. A woman said in conversation to a group of girls looking for men to date, "Look for a man whose wife has just died or has had a truly bad divorce. They are so broken and demoralized, you can build them back into whatever type of man you want. Broken toys are happy to just be played with." If a man said that about a woman, it would be considered extremely offensive. It was just so toxic. Forget his feelings or personality. I want to rebuild it the way I want him to be. Story 37. I overheard my former boss complaining about an argument that he and his wife had that weekend. I'm still confused about why he felt comfortable sharing this near me, as he was in his colleague's office with the door open, and I was only a few feet away. He said his wife was standing on the balcony of their apartment and threatening to jump. His response was something to the effect of, "Do what you want. I'm going to go get a drink." They now have a small child. I haven't worked for him for years now, but that really bothered me. His retelling of what sounded like her genuine desperation and his coldness actually scared me.